I remember the first day I put on the uniform as if it were carved into my skin. The fabric smelled like starch and promise, starched edges and a crispness that made my chest feel larger than it was. I was 20, full of a kind of neat conviction that made decisions sharp and consequences distant. I told myself I was joining for duty, for family tradition, for the paycheck, for the chance to see places my childhood couldn't reach. The truth was messy, eh? I wanted to belong somewhere that had rules and a clear map, where every move meant something and confusion was rarer than obedience. Boot camp ate me and remade me. The drills hollowed out habits I didn't know I'd been clinging to. The lazy walk, the too quick smile, the careful weighing of what words to say. I learned to obey before I learned to ask, and that order made me safer than any conversation could. We were taught to move as one, to trust the man on our left to move when we moved, to sweep when he swept. At night, lying on a cot in a room of other cots, the silence would press against my ears, and the memory of my mother's face would come to me like a care package I was afraid to open. The men around me snored with the calm of someone who expected to wake up tomorrow and do it all again. We were young enough to survive the assault course without thinking of the cost. My first deployment felt like stepping into a painting I'd been told about all my life, but never shown. The line between heroics and horror was thinner than I'd been promised. It shimmered and shifted under the sun and in the rain. There were moments that felt cinematic. Convoys cutting through dawn, the halo of early light making dust look like gold, and moments so ugly they would unfix the frame forever. I learned to speak the language of conflict in ways that had nothing to do with English. The cadence of a radio voice, the weight of a kit bag, the small rituals that made danger tolerable. I learned to carry both a rifle and the memory of laughter, sometimes in the same breath. We lost men. Names that were once easy to say became heavy with silence. In my mind, I still recite them, not as a litany, but to prove they existed. Miguel, who could tell a joke in 3 languages. Jared, who loved cartoons and would sketch them between shifts. Hassan, whose quiet voice could cut through the loudest doubt. The day we buried them, the flag looked less like a symbol and more like a formal excuse for grief. We folded it and handed it to a family that had never slept in our boots, and so had never learned how to stand in the middle of things that don't make sense. We whispered condolences and performed rites, which is to say we did what humans do when they are asked to carry unbearable weight. We did it with hands that trembled. The firefights themselves are a blur in the way that only very intense things become blur, stars of sound and color that don't resolve into comfortable stories. Adrenaline does strange arithmetic. It multiplies minutes and divides pain. It makes you choose things so fast they feel inevitable. I still have a reflexive map of angles in my mind, where the nearest cover is when you see a flash, the way light bounces off a corrugated wall, the space you take to make a throw effective. These are not things I ever thought I'd catalog, and yet they sit where recipes should be, precise and compulsive. I remember a night when everything changed course. We were on patrol in a neighborhood that smelled like bread and diesel. A corner of the town held a small grocery where the old man who ran it would wake before dawn and sweep the stoop with a broom as delicate as a violin bow. That night the sky was generous with stars. I could see the constellations I had first learned back home, but they were rearranged by a noise I'd never heard before. The shot came from somewhere behind a shuttered door. We crossed the street, each step measured. The world during a firefight becomes a tape recorder, playing only what is necessary. There was shouting, the sound of a vehicle crunching gravel, someone yelling my nickname in a voice that later broke into something that was not quite sound. When the smoke cleared, my shoulder hurt in a way that made me curse without thinking. But the worst hurt was the sudden knowledge of who had stopped breathing beside me. I carried survivors back to medevac points and watched the helicopter rotor wash take dust into small storms. The rotor blades seemed to slice through the air and through time. People in black robes on the edge of the encampment prayed with hands that moved like slow birds. A child, no older than 8, gripped a toy that had been painted in forgotten colors, his eyes full of a question I didn't have a license to answer. We were taught to be efficient with compassion. Give water, give a blanket, take names, keep moving. But some questions weren't on the checklist. Where does a child's need for a father go when a father becomes a casualty? Who carries the lullaby across a border? Back on base, the quiet hits differently. There are fewer fireworks and more hours, and hours are dangerous when they are empty. You can measure the distance between action and thought and how much room there is for remorse. I learned to talk about the weather and sports and the next leave, because those conversations were like bandages. inelegant, often insufficient, and yet better than nothing. The problem with ordinary talk is that it doesn't close the wound. It only keeps the edges from catching. I came home in the middle of the night on a flight that smelled of coffee and recycled hope. The customs line was long, yet short in the sense that it moved with the momentum of redundancy. I walked out into an airport that had been reconfigured by suburban stores and families, and the fluorescent brightness of a world that had kept going. My mother hugged me like someone reuniting with a lost artifact. She smelled like bread and lavender, the small, unchanged things that save you if you let them. I felt both the relief of not being on a constant alert and the vertigo of a different kind of danger, the one that comes from feeling invisible in a place where everyone else insists life is a linear climb. Veteran transition programs gave me forms, names, numbers, group sessions. There were men and women in rooms with coffee that's usually too bitter for the kind of human yearning there. We sat in chairs arranged in a circle because everyone had told us circles made for safer conversations. I liked the others in the room immediately for their fractures. They laughed at the same things as I did. Awkwardness, bureaucratic failures, the absurdity of needing a referral for something that's obviously broken. But laughter in those rooms was often like a bandage held together by stern hands. We were all trying to explain a thing that might not be explainable. The ways war gets into the small bones of your daily life. Sleep was where the war followed me the most faithfully. I would wake with the taste of metallic air in my mouth, with a sense of movement, as if there were always some distance to run. Nightmares have their own grammar. They don't always show the worst things. Sometimes they replay good things with small, violent edits. A son's birthday cake missing a candle, a telephone ringing with no one on the line. I learned to wake slowly, to tell my body it was safe, to count the minutes before the edges hardened into fear. This was a skill that had no rank, no medal, no certificate. It was an intimate exercise in convincing my muscles to stop listening to a world that cared so little. Relationships outside of the military suffered under the weight of a vocabulary no civilian possessed. My partner, bless her patient, clever heart, would say, "Tell me about your day." And I would close like a book with a missing chapter. How do you tell someone that there are parts of you that are in another country, still walking patrols, still folding flags? How do you say that a joke a friend used to make now hits like a splinter you can't remove? There were arguments about small things that weren't small, about timetables and silence, and whether we were part of the same plan. Love requires attendance. War often demands absence. Work became an awkward test. I tried going to school, took up classes in a subject I thought would be safe, history, because it felt like a place where other people's violence had already been cataloged. I learned to sit through lectures and to let my hand move across pins like a metronome. People treated me like an exhibit, fascinated at first, then distant once their curiosity wore thin. I was told, often kindly, to find new purpose. The phrase had a double edge. It was comforting but also a tiny accusation, as if the fact that my sense of purpose had been shaped by uniform and mission were something to be corrected rather than understood. Medication and therapy became tools I used and debated like a person choosing a new line of defense. I tried to be pragmatic, sleeping pills for the nights when nightmares reigned, anti-anxiety pills like a rope pulled across a stormy river. Therapists asked me about triggers and coping mechanisms, taught me to breathe with intention, to label feelings with names not from the battlefield. Talking, I discovered, was a strange kind of vulnerability. It asks you to give away specifics that the parts of your brain trained to survive insist on hiding. Gradually, the language of therapy softened the edges. I learned to say, I felt scared, without adding, and I shouldn't have, which was the implicit sentence I'd been tacking on for years. There were beautiful, strange consolations. I began to volunteer at a center that helped families of fallen soldiers. The work was not glamorous. It involved phone calls, paperwork, and being physically present in ways that were sometimes dull and sometimes holy. I would hold a hand at a memorial service and feel the tiny combustions of shared memory, the way grief can be less isolating when offered a common language. I learned names again, like how one learns a new city. Parents would cry, then tell me stories of their child that I had no way to corroborate, but whose truth I could feel in the way eyes brightened and the voice softened. Sometimes I would take long drives to nowhere in particular, the car an instrument of forgetting. I drove the coast for a week once, letting the sea erode the sharpest parts of me. The ocean has a way of making things small and enormous simultaneously. Standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the wind behave like an understanding friend, I would breathe until I could hold my breath no longer and then exhale it all into the sea. The waves accept everything. They swallow shards and send back pebbles polished and indifferent. I also discovered the small kindnesses that anchor you. A neighbor watering a friend's plant when we were on leave. The barista who learned my order and who asked about my day in a way that felt like a lifeline. The mailman who paused for a minute and said a simple, "Thank you." These gestures add up, like coins in a jar. They do not undo the past, but they add layers of proof that the world, while indifferent in its large motions, can be kind in its small ones. I returned to the old training ground once, years after I'd been there as a recruit, as if to check whether I had been dreaming. The parade field had a flagpole that threw a long shadow across the grass. A new class of recruits ran drills with the same aggressive hope that I'd once possessed. I felt the familiar tug in my chest, nostalgia, regret, a sense of kinship with the young men and women who still believed in clear maps. I didn't speak to them at first. Who was I to interrupt their certainty? But one of them lagged behind, and we ended up talking about small things, the absurdity of the sergeant's jokes, the difficulty of ironing seams, the hunger for a good meal. He looked at me with a kind of open curiosity. "Did it change you?" he asked. The question was simple and devastating in the way that young people's questions often are. I told him yes and no. Yes, because I had been carved by experience into someone with new reflexes and a different mapping of danger. No, because at the core, I was a person who loved, feared, and laughed. He nodded like someone filing this for future use. Time has a weird arithmetic for veterans. There are the days on the calendar, and then there are the anniversaries that are etched into the body. A certain smell, a certain song, a certain date can open a door I had thought bolted. Sometimes the years stretch like elastic. Other times they compress until an entire decade sits in a single memory. There are birthdays I counted twice. The day I returned and every subsequent return, not necessarily to a place, but to a state of being where the past had stopped hurting in the same sharp way. I learned to forgive myself in small increments. Forgiveness is not a thunderclap. It's a series of tiny, deliberate choices to stop letting the past define the entirety of the present. It's accepting that you made decisions with incomplete knowledge and that blaming yourself endlessly is not penance, but a kind of cruelty. I began to view regret as data, what I could do differently now, what I could teach others, which old reflexes needed untraining. Forgiveness also meant acknowledging the system that put us in harm's way and understanding that we were not purely agents of our fate. We were people moving in an apparatus that values obedience, sometimes above misunderstanding. There have been people in my life who made me better without trying to be heroic. One of them was my neighbor, Mrs. Ellery, widowed and nimble-fingered, who baked more cookies than any one person should own and left little stacks by my door. She never once asked me about my deployment, but insisted on telling me about her own mundane victories. A rosebush that finally took, the price of sugar, the antics of her cat. She would sit on her stoop with a glass of iced tea and watch the sun graduate. There is a kind of safety in being optically watched by someone who believes in your existence without demanding an account of your trauma. These small domestic rituals matter as much as any therapy or prescription. My hands sometimes still move as if checking a piece of equipment. Reaching for a doorknob, I might pause to sweep with my eyes. Standing in a crowded room, I orient myself to exit points. These are adaptations that make the world manageable and also reminders that some parts of me are still tuned to a frequency that most people rarely use. I've learned to translate these habits into caution rather than suspicion. At times, the veteran identity is embraced like a medal. At other times, it's a cloak you want to take off and leave at the door. I am no single thing. I am someone who learned to hold a rifle and later learned to hold a newborn with a fear and tenderness that surprised me. I am someone who can tell you how to fold a flag and how to bake a proper loaf of bread. I am capable of brutality and boundless tenderness, sometimes in the same afternoon. The paradox of service is that it can enrich and impoverish, build and erode, often at once. One of the most important lessons I've learned is the necessity of community. Veterans are often framed as lone heroes, but the truth is more communal. We are knit into networks, families, therapists, fellow veterans, neighbors, whose combined efforts make life livable. I found a support group that met weekly in a church basement. We brought coffee and bad muffins and our mistakes. We spoke in a code that matured into honesty. We told each other the hard truths, that sometimes you don't get better in a straight line, that failure is part of learning again. We shared tools, how to sleep through a panic attack, how to explain things to kids, how to fill out an unemployment form. The group was not a cure but a series of small hands that steadied mine when I needed to sign things I didn't understand. There were days when public sentiment was kind, when strangers bought me coffee and said, "Thank you," like a key unlocking gratitude. There were also days when political rhetoric made me uneasy, when the causes we fought for became slogans trotted out for headlines. I learned to separate gratitude for service from blind endorsement of policy. Patriotism, I came to see, is not a uniform but an action, the steady work of caring for one another, the willingness to reckon honestly with the past, the insistence that we learn from mistakes rather than recycling them. I also learned to hold grief without being consumed by it. Grief is a strange, persistent companion, like a dog that insists on sleeping on your bed for a while. You can train it to be less intrusive, but you can't abolish it. You can honor the lost without letting the lost define you. I visit graves sometimes, not out of duty, but because it's a human thing to speak to the dead. I tell them about small victories, a promotion, a child's graduation I watched on video, a joke that landed. It feels ridiculous and necessary all at once. The ritual is not for them, but for us. It keeps memory alive without locking us in a freeze frame. Telling my story publicly was another kind of reckoning. I began to write because silence costs you more than any admission ever could. Writing is not therapy exactly, but it is a way of arranging the noise into something that makes sense to another brain. My first essay about the war was clumsy, stitched from fragments, but people responded with emails that carried pieces of their own lives. One woman wrote to me about her husband who had come home different and how writing about it had allowed him to laugh again. Another man told me he saw his son's name in my words and had begun to reach out. These small correspondences make the act of telling less self-indulgent. They make it a bridge. There are parts of me that still resist public exposure. Some nights, I'm unwilling to let the world have the full measure of what I carry. Privacy becomes a kind of preservation. But there is also a duty I feel to speak, especially to younger people who feel the tug of uniform for reasons both national and personal. I tell them, go in with your eyes open, not to scare, but to honor the complexity of choice. Service is noble and it is costly. It can teach you discipline and humility, and it can also change what home feels like. If you're asked to go, ask questions about what you'll be doing, what support you'll get, how the end of your service is handled. There are answers, and there are omissions. I want them to have as many answers as possible. I have reconciled with the idea that I am not solely defined by what I did in uniform. I garden now, with a kind of militant patience. I understand the timing of seeds and seasons and find a strange solace in the quiet repetition of watering. There is a satisfaction in watching something grow that does not require you to be vigilant for threats. I plant tomatoes and basil, and when a fruit ripens I feel an almost ridiculous volume of pride. You learn to measure victory differently after war. A ripe tomato can be as triumphant as anything. Parenthood offered me both terror and an opportunity for radical reorientation. When my child was born, I felt a fear so sharp it was almost physical, the fear of repeating patterns, of being absent in all the ways that matter. I promised myself to be present, to learn how to be gentle, to accept that unconditional love is not a thing one earns, but a thing one practices. There were fits of impatience I regretted, nights when loneliness pushed all the old instincts into play. But there were also mornings when the small hand of a child found mine, and the world receded until only love occupied the frame. Those mornings were instruction, how to be small and large at the same time. I also came to see mentorship as a duty. The men and women who came after me needed someone who could speak honestly about what service meant. I volunteered to be that voice in whatever ways I could, sharing practical tools, offering rides to appointments, attending memorials. Mentorship is not advice so much as testimony and willingness to sit with another person's fear. Sometimes it is a boring repetition of simple things. Sometimes it is guiding someone through the paperwork of disability claims. Bureaucracy is a second battlefield for veterans, full of forms and waiting rooms and the danger of invisibility. I learned to navigate it and to help others do the same. There are days when all of this feels enormous and days when it feels manageable. There were times I looked at the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. I had to reacquaint myself with humor and with the small, ordinary joys that make a life livable. A concert, the smell of rain, the absurdity of an old sitcom. I cultivate these things deliberately now, like a gardener tending a fragile plot. I find that a combination of discipline and surrender works best. Discipline keeps me from sliding into the worst reflexes. Surrender allows for rest when discipline would become rigidity. I have also found that time itself is a kind teacher. It doesn't always heal. Sometimes it simply layers new experiences over old ones until the sharpest edges are dulled. People ask if the ache ever goes away. It's not about a complete disappearance. It's about learning to inhabit a body that remembers differently. There are scars you learn to see as maps. They tell you where you have been and offer a cautionary tale about where not to go again. As I age, the veteran part of me becomes more a thread than a garment. It weaves through my life, but does not suffocate it. I attend ceremonies and sometimes speak, because memory is a civic responsibility. I insist on being honest. Wars have consequences for the living and the dead, and we owe it to both to be truthful. We must tell stories not to make politics of pain, but to illuminate the human cost so future choices are made with fuller awareness. There are parts of the world that look at veterans as relics or as monuments. I prefer to be a neighbor, a father, a friend, a person who understands that service is a phase of life rather than its entirety. If I could leave one message for anyone listening, it's this. Treat returned soldiers with the curiosity of someone willing to meet another human being where they are. Ask, but don't demand. Offer help, but accept refusal as often as you offer. Small acts of care matter more than any single grand gesture. Sometimes, in a quiet moment, I imagine a future where the lessons learned cost us less. A place where conflict resolution is not always forged at the barrel of a gun, and where young people still find dignified, meaningful ways to serve when shorter, cheaper alternatives are possible. I imagine communities that care for their wounded not as liabilities, but as living repositories of experience, useful, fallible, and human. People sometimes ask whether I would go back, given the choice. It's a complicated question with edges that glint. There's honor in the call, yes. There's also an ache for the parts of me I left behind on foreign soil. I would go back to serve if called in a way that felt morally and strategically sound, but I would do so differently now, wiser about the costs and more demanding of the rationales. The greatest change in me is the skepticism toward easy narratives and the fierce attachment to accountability. We must be careful about how we use the people who trust us with their youth and bodies. At the end of the day, my life has become a ledger of sorts, a place where loss and gain are tallied not as pure opposites, but as elements in a complex equation. I have loved and been loved. I have suffered and been consoled. I have been brave and cowardly, generous and small. The mantle of veteranhood is neither wholly noble nor ignoble. It is human. It is a set of experiences that asks for humility and respect in equal measure. I still wake sometimes to a dream of engines and orders, but the dreams hold loosens as the years go on. I can sit with my family on a summer evening and watch the light solidify into gold and not have the moment be ambushed by the past. These small respites are not trivial. They are victories measured in minutes of uninterrupted peace. I treasure them because I know how fragile they can be. If anyone hears this story, if someone who served sits with these words or a son or daughter hears them, know that survival is a messy, uneven work. You will not always be brave. You will not always be right. You will find ways to be tender that surprise you. You will find communities that will carry you and others that will drop you. Be patient with yourself. Seek help. Offer help. Remember the names of the men and women who did not come back, not as a burden, but as a form of gratitude that keeps memory functional rather than fatal. Live in the company of truth where you can, and let small acts of kindness be the scaffolding upon which you rebuild. I have learned to love the ordinary again. I take out the trash and sweep the porch and make coffee the way my father taught me. Strong enough to feel like a start, sweet enough to admit comfort. I learn new things. How to complain less and listen more. How to ask for help without shame. How to enjoy silence without imagining it full of explosions. I find small rituals that center me. Watering the basil, checking the mailbox, looking up at the sky in the quiet moments, and counting the visible planes, not as threats, but as machines that sometimes ferry people home. The sound of a distant siren will still make me check the doorway, and certain smells will still send me back in time. But the frequency of those visceral leaps has lessened. The war remains a chapter, vivid and painful, but no longer the only story I can tell about myself. I am many things now: veteran, gardener, father, neighbor, friend, imperfect citizen. I carry what I must and set down what I can. In the end, perhaps the most valuable lesson is the one about presence. Being present for the people who matter, showing up at funerals, for birthdays, for the small, tedious operations of daily life. These are the acts that eventually stitch a life back together. They are not dramatic. They are often unnoticed. And they matter more than heroics because they sustain the living. If you listen to this tale as a caution or as a comfort, take from it what you will. For me, it is a map of a life that has been at times broken and at times whole. I hope it offers something honest. That war changes you. That loss reshapes your heart. And that living afterward is an ongoing, communal process that asks us to be kinder, smarter, and more accountable. There is still laughter. There is still love. There is still work to be done. There is still a long silence after the gunfire. And in that silence we find ourselves, awkward and human, learning how to live again.